For the input. Thank you very much to Corporate Europe Observatory for food for thought. My proposal is we don't have questions, we don't have a discussion, we jump immediately in the official meeting where we come back to the content in our discussion with our guests. Otherwise, we run totally out of time, and that is not the idea of today. So let me open our meeting. The official meeting of the Delegation for Relations with South Africa. Anything on the agenda? Otherwise, I would like to immediately adopt the agenda. Let me tell you that we have the interpretation in English, French, and German. You have received the draft agenda in advance, so I don't think that we have problems with that. If nobody is raising any objections, we declare the agenda for adopted. Approval of minutes of the meetings. The draft minutes of the last meeting of the 2nd April have been circulated before. If there are no comments from your side by tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock, the draft minutes will be deemed approved. Let me switch over to number 3, Chair's announcements. I have a very good announcement for our delegation. It was a hard fight, but we got a COP decision on our working plan to invite our South African colleagues this year to the visit to Brussels. So we will have a IPM, interparliamentary meeting, not in 2026, but in 2025, given the fact that the original plan was to go to South Africa in the late 24, and it was postponed. And by doing so, we can take the chance to bring in our South African colleagues a fortnight before the G20 summit, which is of enormous importance for our bilateral work. And this is also a fortnight before the foreseen EU-South African mini-summit, which was agreed between the European side and South Africa in their last high-level meeting. So the IPM, as we proposed by our bureau, that was, of course, a conversation with our bureau members, Paolo and Tilly. So that was our joint plan, was agreed for Brussels, the 5th and the 6th of November. So please put that already into your calendars, into your diaries. We will come back to you as soon as possible with more details. Let me repeat, the 5th and the 6th of November in Brussels is accepted by the COP. And we will, before the summer break, also go further and communicate this invitation, what we, of course, have done earlier informally, officially with our South African colleagues. Number 4, the Clean Trade and Investment Partnership with a focus on production of green hydrogen. We have the pleasure to have guests here today. I will in a minute give the floor to them. We have invited 4 guest speakers, Ms. Yegeshni Moodley from the South African environmental NGO groundWork. You have seen her already in the film. Ms. Tanya van Meelis from the Congress of South African Trade Union Federation, COSATU. Ms. Cláudia Azevedo from the Jacques Delors think tank, who is permanently also observing and watching our CTIP and similar trade agreements with third countries, and Ms. Dora Correia of the European Commission, DG Trade, Director in DG Trade for relations with ACP region, South and Southeast Asia, Australia, New Zealand, trade and sustainable development, Green Deal, all the issues at stake for us today. We will give them the floor remotely via Interactio. Our issue of today, the Clean Trade and Investment Partnership, or CTIP, in short, is a new trade instrument introduced by the European Commission only recently. Content-wise, the partnership aims to secure access to critical raw materials, clean energy, and clean technology while establishing mutually beneficial outcomes. The first CTIP with South Africa was launched during the EU-South Africa Summit in March 25. A key interest of the EU is specifically accessing, as we saw, green hydrogen, a low-carbon energy source produced through the electrolysis of water using renewable energy. Indeed, the EU is investing heavily in green hydrogen as it is considered essential for the Union's efforts to decarbonize its economy, reduce dependence on fossil fuels, and meet its climate goals. In this case, South Africa is seen as a potential major supplier of green hydrogen, thanks to its abundant renewable energy resources. At this stage, we know this new partnership seeks to complement existing EU trade agreements through a faster, more flexible and targeted approach tailored to specific business interests. It forms part of the broader Clean Industrial Deal, which aims to promote green technologies and industries, particularly across supply chains. The EU-South Africa CTIP will be supported by a 4.7 billion euro global gateway investment package. The Commission would like to conclude the negotiations with the South African side by mid-November, ahead of the planned bilateral meeting with the South African government, what I called already the mini-summit on the sidelines of the G20. The given timeline is thus very limited. Against this background, some concerns have been raised, as we saw also in the input earlier. But not only from South African side, we have also worries about the transparency and the parliamentary oversight, especially since we do not have a sound legal ground on the agreements. The Commission calls it a light agreement, which does not need a consent procedure as normal trade agreements do according to our regulations. CTIP is intended to be a non-binding agreement, potentially prompting questions about its ability to produce concrete outcomes. Other concerns, we saw potential environmental damage, social disruption are raised from South African speakers, the lack of adequate consideration for needs of local communities and domestic consumption of green hydrogen in South Africa. We saw the documentary. With those introductory remarks, we come back to our guests, but to avoid misunderstandings, perhaps two remarks ahead of that. Having seen this screening, it comes immediately to my mind, thanks to the NGO again, that on both sides, we enjoy the privilege to discuss in democratic environments. We are the parliament to scrutinize what is going on, and our speakers in the movie enjoyed the freedom to be critical of what they see to come in their interpretation in a country that allows, according to its constitution, for this freedom. It's not all over the world like that. And many so-called mini deals are done in areas where we have much more worries about the freedom to criticize, the freedom to speak up, and the freedom to associate and to communicate. That was my number one, and my number two, only to avoid misunderstandings. Each way of transforming our societies raises conflicts and raises questions. The only question is whether we have democratic ways to listen to people, to find good solutions that are suitable for everybody, for all communities, and not only single-minded driven by those who are powerful and mighty. This is the essential room for debate here. So don't think we are against intensifying the collaboration between South Africa and the European Union. Quite the opposite is the case. But we are filling the democratic space to have a full debate where to go and what to do. This is the intention of that meeting. Having said that, it is my pleasure to give the floor to our first remote speaker, Ms. Yegeshni Moodley. She's Climate and Energy Senior Campaign Manager of the South African Environmental Justice Group groundWork. And we saw her already in the screening. Please, you have the floor for some 5 minutes and come in to our debate.
Thank you kindly, Chair, and also for your insightful remarks that you've made. And good afternoon to the committee, and thank you for the opportunity to address you today. I'm based in Durban in South Africa at the southern tip of our continent. South Africa is a land of sunny skies, open veldt, and unique biodiversity. Its people are rich in heritage and culture, each speaking their own tongue with customs passed on through generations. It's also a land of contradiction and paradoxes, with the highest inequality of any country, an ever-widening chasm between the haves and the have-nots, a legacy of apartheid and colonial destruction, and the insatiable minerals energy complex, which still dictates our industrial development pathway. As South Africans, we bear the scars of economic growth and development on our bodies, in lungs that fail, brains that are stunted, children that do not see adulthood, young men that never have the opportunity to age. The mines, chimney stacks, and waste dumps that are dotted across South Africa were our first taste of colonization. People that came across the ocean to take away through roads and railways that they built for our benefit. They take the land, the minerals. They also take our dignity and our heritage. They promise wealth, prosperity, education, a better life for our children. And green hydrogen has been marketed as a promised panacea for all our energy transition woes. It will light our homes, power our factories, and reduce the pollution burden of our people. What it needs is what we have in abundance, sun and space. But there are critical flaws in this hypothesis. There is no empty land in my country, and energy is never free. The indigenous peoples of South Africa are amongst the earliest peoples of our world, inhabiting the land in a nomadic fashion and being subject to violence by all subsequent invaders of their territories. More recently, black South Africans were forcibly removed to locations, the ubiquitous townships, to provide cheap, unskilled labor resource for mines and industries. These communities continue to struggle for restorative justice under past polluting harms. It is under this burden of injustice that the hydrogen economy enters, not seeking to redress the systemic roots of South Africa's energy crisis, but glossing it over with a shiny new way of working. In its current paradigm, hydrogen is perpetuating the past harms, not actively breaking these bonds and recreating energy for us. It is not dismantling these broken systems, but reviving them through public subsidies. The corporate impunity that keeps polluters safe from accountability today is being amplified through the government deals of the future. We, as South African communities, ask of you, decision makers in faraway lands, please exercise your power for our good. Introduce corporate accountability, due diligence, true sustainability with justice as a core principle. Make public money for public benefit. the restoration of land, the protection of the vulnerable, universal health care, affordable energy, true better lives for generations of South Africans. We need reskilling for our workers, social protections, and redress for past harms. A new model of working where establishing benefits in host communities becomes the norm. A lasting legacy of development that uplifts and upholds community values in the spirit of Ubuntu. I am because we are. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your very valuable input to our discussion. And I now give the floor to Ms. Tanya van Meelis. She serves as head of the policy unit and labor market policy coordinator at the Congress of South African Trade Unions.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm honored to be here. It's very important that we are able to address you, and we thank you for that opportunity. One of the core principles in a just transition is that there is social dialogue, and indeed this discussion is part of that social dialogue. It's important to social dialogue with workers as well as other members of civil society, because we together bear the brunt of an unjust transition, of economic dislocation, and of changes to our economies broadly that we may not have any control over. One of the key pillars, another key pillar in the just transition, is recognizing that human rights, sustainable development, poverty eradication, and a just transition all need to be built together in forming a climate response. We do want to have a response that is going to benefit workers and communities, where air is clean, where workers are not stopped from working because there's flooding in factories, where people are healthy. To do this, we need to work together. I remind you as well of the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities as set out in the Paris Agreement, or to frame it differently, as set out in the WTO as special and differential treatment. And in saying that we need to treat countries as they are and looking at their own specific needs, I want to highlight a few specific problems that we face in South Africa. The first is that we face unacceptably high unemployment. Our expanded unemployment rate is 43.1%. Our labor absorption rate is 40.3%. That means out of every 5 people who could be working between the ages of 15 and 64, only 2 out of every 5 people work. So of course we face large amounts of poverty and inequality as well. We also face the challenge of trying to transform our economy, which is one of the most carbon-intensive economies in the world, with a high reliance on coal, when we have stagnant economic growth, our GDP is 0.6%, and when we have a debt to GDP ratio of 76.2%. Not only do we have these internal challenges, but we also face external shocks. And I would be remiss not to bring up CBAM and the potentially devastating impact that CBAMs will have on South Africa. Potentially 422,000 jobs could be lost as a result of the CBAMs. So in examining the CTIP, we are able to draw on our past experience of the JET RP. COSATU had been very critical of the JET RP, and I want to raise some of those criticisms now, because in fact some of them run through to the current program as well. So the first criticism of the JET RP was that there wasn't sufficient or meaningful stakeholder engagement. This seems to be the case here as well, although we do acknowledge and thank you for meeting with us today. But without stakeholder engagement, we risk designing policies that fail to address the realities on the ground. The process of the JET RP was not transparent. The details of funding were not transparent. The same seems to hold true for the CTIP. The program in the JET RPs focused on investment and financing for profitable sectors for private investment, rather than focusing on how we develop the country as a whole and make sure that we have a just energy transition and development. That seems to be the case here as well. The JET RP didn't integrate with industrial policy, and we have very serious concerns which I'll go into around that in terms of the CTIP. There was insufficient focus in the JET RP of social ownership. Ownership by the state, ownership by workers. Ownership was concentrated in very large companies. We fear that that's going to happen again. Promoting social ownership and state ownership is a key means of redistribution, but it's a key means of addressing the stark inequalities that we face now, both in assets and in incomes. The JET RP didn't focus sufficiently, if at all, on social protection, on workers and communities. We see the same problem now again with the CTIP. The JET RPs didn't address electricity affordability and energy democracy. We fear the same for CTIP, and I'm going to go into those details. And lastly, there was insufficient grant funding, making the JET RP program extremely expensive. That's happening here as well, with grant funding being less than 7% of the amount allocated. We acknowledge that there are opportunities in CTIP, but unless we address some of the key principles and concerns that I've just raised above, we risk a transition that deepens inequality and perpetuates historical injustices. And the previous speaker spoke most eloquently on those historical injustices. We must guard against the danger of a new energy colonialism, and green, hydrogen, and other renewable projects must not replicate the exploitative patterns of the past. So I want to raise very specific concerns for your consideration above what has already been raised. The first one is, what is the opportunity cost associated with CTIP? Green hydrogen projects are prioritizing exports to the EU. What that could do is that it leaves us not investing in critical infrastructure in our own energy infrastructure. This could leave us in the dark, literally and figuratively. There's a real danger that the investments driving export detract from investments for industrialization in South Africa, building supply chains, supporting localization, building value chains, not only in South Africa, but also in the region itself. So in fact, the cost would be very, very high. In fact, we would have a situation where we wouldn't have development. It would lead to gradual deindustrialization, especially in the face of CBAM as well. If we are unable to get sufficient and affordable renewable energy for South African companies, we're not going to be able to address the key challenges we have in terms of our exports. In order to promote industrialization in the South African economy, we think that the project must explicitly include support for localization, which includes developing local industrial capacity to, for example, produce fuel cells or ammonia cracking or the equipment and components used. But a third critical factor that we need to look at is that of cost. And our development is impeded by the high cost of financing and intellectual property. I reiterate our call for a greater share of grant funding, and we want to be sure that the debt that is given, the interest rates being charged, are indeed highly concessional. But what we'd also ask of you to consider is making technology available That requires opening the TRIPS waiver for technology transfer for decarbonisation, so that South Africa and other developing countries have access to the tools we need for a sustainable transition. We call on the EU to honour its commitment under the Paris Agreement by facilitating technology transfer to the global south to support our transition. The adjustment costs to workers and communities cannot be ignored. We face large job loss. Workers who lose their jobs in South Africa are not likely to get a new job. 77% of workers who are currently unemployed have been employed for over a year. We do have some social support, but it's not sufficient to say, well, rely on South Africa's social support systems. And I want to give you some stark examples. We have a social relief of distress grant. It's 370 Rand a month for those who are most poor. That equates to 17 euros a month. You can't go out for dinner in Europe for 17 euros a month. We have a child support grant which is paid to 13.1 million people. Translates to 26 euros a month. So where workers lose jobs, or where workers lose jobs because we are not industrializing, there's the opportunity cost, they do not get jobs, they are plunged into poverty. 55% of people in South Africa live below the upper bound poverty line. Skills development is critical, and we call on training programs, not only in education and skills development, but practical skills development on the ground to help workers and those disaffected build new pathways in local economic development with tangible jobs, sustainable jobs, not theoretical jobs. We want to ask you to promote social ownership so that workers and communities can be empowered and own real assets and get income from that asset. We further request that you do full social impact assessments and full environmental impact assessments to provide a comprehensive assessment of the impacts in a range of areas, including access to water, given that we are a water-scarce country, land rights, displacement of communities, abuse of human rights, coastal destruction and deprivation of communities living on the coast and their ability to fish. We ask you to look at the social impact of access to energy and addressing energy poverty. And we ask you to look at the current package and see how it's going to raise our debt burden and divert critically needed resources for social and economic development towards paying debt. So while the CETA project offers opportunities, it does hold significant risks. And we need to be aware of these challenges. We need to deliberate on them. And this is what we ask of you. With the right policy, we can drive local economic development, create decent jobs, and build resilient communities. But this requires a progressive vision, one that prioritizes people over profits and collaboration over competition. So I call on you to please deliberate, to actively drive a developmental agenda. It will require detail, deep and wide consultation, hard work, and shifting boundaries and current constraints. But we must.
Could you come to an end, please, Ms. van Meelis?
We mustn't be discouraged. We must be highly ambitious. In the words of Nelson Mandela, it always seems impossible until it is done. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your insightful contribution. We now have heard local community voice. We have trade unions, and I'm pleased to give the floor to Ms. Cláudia Azevedo from Jacques Delors Institute. Academic and research is still missing, and then we come back to our institutional conversation.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Cher, for the invitation to be here and participate in this discussion today. As it was mentioned earlier, we at Europe Jacques Delors have been following closely the discussions around the CITIPs, and the reason why it's because we see enormous potential on this new tool for two main reasons. First, because we believe that it's time to rebuild trust and deepen the engagement with our partners in the Global South, many of which have raised concerns around our measures adopted in the context of the Green Deal, including South Africa, and the previous speaker mentioned, for instance, South Africa's concerns linked to CBAM and so on. So we do believe that it's time to deepen engagement and try to focus on issues of mutual interest. And then second, we also believe that CITIPs could fill a really important gap in the EU's toolbox for engaging with third countries. So today we have comprehensive FTAs, which are rather slow and politically heavy. And on the other hand, we have other soft tools like these MOUs on raw materials that have been concluded with several countries, which are often weak and also lack financial backing. And there are several concerns around transparency and so on. So we believe that CITIPs could be a good middle ground, more agile and less comprehensive than FTAs, but ideally with more substance and teeth than these MOUs that have been concluded. And then another advantage is that unlike these other tools, CITIPs, like the name indicates, have decarbonization objectives at their core. So this is why we see quite a lot of opportunities with this new tool. As of now, they are foreseen as MOUs, so non-binding instruments, which will obviously limit their enforceability, and among other things. And in our view, of course, we do believe that this is a missed opportunity. We at Europe Jacques Delors have been calling for the CITIPs to be mini trade deals, that is legally binding instruments, but with a reduced scope compared to traditional FTAs. We do understand the constraints of the Commission at the moment and the need to act quickly and go with a non-binding instrument, at least at a first stage. But we would like, and we have heard from the Commission, and we really welcome this, the fact that even though the CITIPs will be non-binding at this stage, that will eventually, they could evolve into into a binding instrument. So this is a possibility that we would like to keep open. And then even within the constraints of a non-binding tool, we think there's still much that can be done. And we should really try our best to maximize the effectiveness of this tool when designing and implementing it. And this is why we think it's a really critical moment to have this conversation, because even though these CITIPs will vary in terms of the scope and the commitments depending on the trading partner in question, the first CITIP with South Africa will set a really important precedent, and obviously other trading partners interested in concluding similar partnerships with the EU will be watching. So I think it's really important for us, civil society, and for the Parliament and all interested stakeholders on both sides to contribute to make sure that this is a tool that works for both sides. And we, in this regard, we do think that the CITIPs should be a coordination framework, and this is something that we've also heard from the Commission, but I will leave this to the next speaker. But we believe that CITIPs should not be another layer of bilateral engagement, but instead serve as a coordination framework to identify gaps and streamline efforts. But this in itself, it's not enough. Like, to deliver on this commitment to make it a mutually beneficial partnership, the CITIPs will have to bring something new to the table. And in this regard, we think that there are three main things that are particularly important: sustainability commitments, the monitoring and implementation, and civil society and Parliament involvement in the discussions. And I'll try to be brief, and I'm happy to expand on all of these elements later on. But when it comes to sustainability, I'm aware that the current economic partnership agreement with the SADC countries already includes a few sustainability commitments when it comes to references to the ILO conventions, non-regression clauses, and so on. But this is a rather old economic partnership agreement, and it would be important from our perspective to include sustainability commitments tailored to the sectors and industries covered by the CTIP, which bring additional sustainability risks. I mean, if we think about the activities that this partnership seeks to facilitate, like extraction and mining, processing, green hydrogen production, and so on, they do carry sustainability risks. So it would be important from our perspective to include some commitments in this regard. And we're not asking for the CITIPs to match the level of commitments in the TSD chapters of FTAs, which are rather comprehensive, but to really focus on this specific areas where the sustainability will be the most important. And this could include references to international frameworks, such as the OECD due diligence guidance on responsible business conduct, the UN guiding principles, and so on, commitments on biodiversity and land use, if we talk about expansion of mining activities, free, prior, and informed consent of local communities, and so on. And the previous speakers have already touched upon it. But beyond the commitments that are included in the text of the partnership, we think that it's important that the CITIP and the global gateway projects that will come with it must not unintentionally worsen the social and environmental conditions on the ground. And I mean, obviously, green hydrogen is a great example, and I will not go more into detail when it comes to the consequences when it comes to water use and the fact that it's energy intensive and so on, because the previous speakers have touched upon it, all the questions around ethical questions and questions around climate justice that it raises. But even if we think about the South African industries, they rely predominantly on coal. I mean, if we look, for instance, at iron and steel, there are some discussions around producing steel in South Africa using green hydrogen, but the current production, it almost relies almost entirely on coal, which means that then the iron and steel industry in South Africa will be highly impacted by CBAM, according to the World Bank index. So we might end up in a situation where South Africa develops this green hydrogen economy geared primarily to the export market, while keeping while the industries at home will still be using coal as a primary source of energy, and will be at a competitive disadvantage when CBAM kicks in. So this is just the kind of considerations that we should have in mind when designing the CITIPs. And then if we talk about monitoring and implementation, this is particularly important in the case of having a non-binding tool, because there is no such thing as legal enforcement, so they must have built-in monitoring systems. This will be really critical to ensure that they will deliver on what they promise, and this could be through setting clear targets from the outset, against which monitor could be against which the progress can be monitored. When it comes to value addition on sustainability or the production of renewable energy for local consumption and so on. And another thing that would be rather important is for the CITIPs to have implementation committees that set time-bound roadmaps for the implementation of these commitments. And the idea, again, is not to replicate the existing structures that exist under the Economic Partnership Agreement that already have joint councils and special committees and so on, but to ensure that there is a clear plan to deliver on the activities that the CITIPs are intended to conduct, to have a standing platform for dialogue, for regulatory, for cooperation, to coordinate in numerous activities on the ground. And this would also be quite important to fulfill a gap that we have seen in previous instruments like the Memorandum of Understanding on MOUs that raise quite a lot of concerns when it comes to transparency, with the roadmaps not being publicly available or not being detailed enough. And then my last point, and I will conclude, is it's important that the CITIPs have meaningful civil society and parliament engagement. And this is not just about providing regular updates, but ensuring that we as civil society and parliament can actively contribute to the design of this CITIP and implementation. And I know that there are some discussions at the Parliament already taking place to see what is the role of the Parliament really in this new type of tools that we will see more and more coming up going forward. And from the side of civil society, I think it would be really important to have, for instance, a regular civil society dialogues on these CITIPs, like they exist already in the context of FTAs, ideally before the first CITIP is concluded. So I think it would go a long way to address concerns around the transparency and the state of play of the current CITIP. And even beyond that, other mechanisms could be considered, like independent complaints mechanisms through which civil society could raise questions linked to the violations of the commitments in the partnership. And this would empower civil society on both sides to actively monitor what is happening on the ground, and would also showcase that sustainability commitments are more than political rhetoric. And even here, there is no need to reinvent the wheel. There are such mechanisms in the context of FTAs, such as a single entry point that the Commission set up in 2021, and it would be important to clarify what is the relevance and to what extent do these mechanisms that already exist in the context of trade agreements apply to these new partnership models. I will leave it at that. These are just some ideas on how CITIPs could be designed and implemented in a way that will deliver real benefits and will bring something new to the table. We at Europe Jacques Delors have published a policy paper a couple of months ago where we provide several policy recommendations for the design and implementation of the CTIPs, and I'm happy to elaborate on those later on any other occasion. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Ms. Azevedo, for this full program that you gave us from your point of view. You are enriching our debates, but you are enriching also you personally as well as Jacques Delors Institute, enriching also the institutional debate here in Europe and here in Brussels and in Strasbourg. It's now high time to bring in the Commission, Ms. Dora Correia, Director in DG Trade at the European Commission. Happy to have you with us today. Thanks for the time that you are willing to share with us. You see a full blow of debate already here, which is seldom enough, I have to say, because we do not have institutionalized ways of communication at the very moment. But we are happy to hear from you where we are, and of course, we are also looking forward that you pick up the one or the other question that was already raised. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Chair. Many thanks for the invitation to participate in this meeting. And I very much agree with you that it is essential to fill the space for democratic debate and discussion. And I see this meeting of the monitoring group going a long way in that direction indeed. I'm very happy to be here to discuss the CTIP with South Africa. As speaker said before me, this will be the first CTIP that we would be concluding, and is in a manner a proof of concept. So I will start by recalling the origins and the objectives of CITIPs, and then zoom in a little bit on South Africa, hoping indeed to pick up on some of the points that were raised today, and then conclude on the next steps and the timeline as you see it. So in terms of the origins and the objectives, just to recall that the clean trade and investment partnerships were announced in the political guidelines of President von der Leyen in the preparations for the start of the second mandate of the President and this college. And it is part of the flagship of what the President called a new economic foreign policy. And the purpose of these CTIPs is indeed to have a whole of government approach, bringing together the different things that the Union and the Commission has been doing with our partners to present a more consistent and coherent front to our partners. This was again elaborated when the Commission put forward the Clean Industrial Deal, where the CITIPs were very much part and parcel, and actually quite an essential element of the external dimension of the clean industrial deal, where, of course, the overall purpose is to promote the decarbonization of our societies, promote the green transition, and at the same time increase the competitiveness, increase the resilience of our economies. And let me maybe dispel a bit a misunderstanding. Of course, the CTIP is this new tool, is this whole of government tool, but in a way it complements the existing tools. And we have, as you know, the biggest network of trade agreements in the world. And can I just say that we are negotiating 8 more, so we're not stopping, 7 of which in my directorate. And those are, of course, the key tools for engagement in terms of trade and investment. The idea of the clean trade and investment partnerships is not to replace trade agreements with mini trade agreements or whatever you want to call them, but rather to complement these existing trade agreements with a wider approach, a wider net, if you like, that allows to bring existing or new dialogues that we have with our trading partners, be they on agricultural matters, on energy, on climate, on critical raw materials, and present again this unified, coherent front to our partners. And I believe that bringing this whole of government approach, bringing this more flexible and in a way more tailored approach to our relations with our partners is essential and allows us also to provide a response to the very unpredictable and very volatile geopolitical and geoeconomic context we operate under. So the CTIPs are in fact designed to better align our external policy action with the economic policy objectives and the decarbonization and climate agenda. That's why I'm saying it's a whole of government approach. And they are intended, these partnerships, to work as an umbrella instrument and aligning our engagement with our partners on trade, on investment, on climate, on energy, and of course on our development cooperation through Global Gateway. So now that I've talked about the concept in general, maybe let me zoom in on South Africa. As I said, the first CTIP is now taking shape with South Africa, and this again will be the proof of concept, I would say. Now, of course, the idea of launching this conversation with South Africa has also to be seen in the context of the overall South African strategy for economic development and decarbonization. And in a way, we are also responding to a call by South Africa to engage and support their own decarbonization and energy transition. This has to be seen, again, in the overall policy and political choices of South Africa and their government, and also in the context of the overall choices that are being made in terms of finding the right energy mix for the future. And let me just recall here, and some of the speakers have mentioned it already, what is the existing energy mix in South Africa? South Africa is dependent on coal for electricity generation up to 84%. This is the current situation. Then 11% only on renewables, 3% on natural gas, and 2% on nuclear. This is the starting point. And this is the starting point on which the National Unity Government in South Africa has elaborated their strategy to carry out the decarbonization of their energy mix and to indeed engage with a JETP, a Just Energy Transition Plan with the EU. And again, here I think it's a question of how can the EU better support and engage with our sovereign partner, South Africa, in bringing forward those objectives. And let me just say here again, Chair, that I very much appreciated what you said in terms of we are working with a partner who has or with whom we have a commonality of values in terms of supporting multilateralism, in terms of supporting a rules-based trading system, in terms of respecting human rights, and in terms of being a democratic society. So again, this is a very important starting point. Of course, as I was saying, we also want the CITIB to be a complement to existing trade agreements. And as I think Cláudia was mentioning just before, we do have a trade agreement with South Africa, the regional agreement that we have, the regional EPA that we have with the SADC region, which has been a very sound basis for our trade relations since 2016. Also, South Africa is actually one of our biggest partners, and the trade flows between the EU and South Africa have been in the last 10 years around 45 to 55 billion euros per year. European investors are the number one source of investment in South Africa, representing over 40% of foreign direct investment. Of course, one element which has also been raised by other speakers, South Africa has important reserves in critical raw materials for the green and digital transition. And of course, the EU and South Africa are parties to the Paris Agreement and share very much common decarbonization objectives. So this was all, I would say, considered as part of the case to establish the first CTIP with South Africa. And looking at the key elements that we have in mind for this CITIP, the objective, our mutual and shared objective, is indeed to strengthen the competitiveness, to strengthen the resilience, and to strengthen the integration of clean supply chains between the EU and South Africa. And what do I mean by clean supply chains? I'm talking about renewable energy, clean technologies, electricity transmission and upgrade of the grid. I'm talking about clean fuels, as indeed we have been discussing green hydrogen, but I'm also talking about the raw materials value chains, i.e. for use in battery supply chains. So with this, what the EU and South Africa want to do is to create, on the one hand, trade and investment opportunities for our businesses, and on the other, support the industrialization and the diversification of South African economy, and of course, supporting the decarbonization strategy, as I mentioned. So how are we going to bring this about? We have two main tools: investments and regulatory cooperation. And here, of course, investments, I think, Chairman, you've already mentioned the Global Gateway Investment Package, which is indeed very significant. But what we also want to do with this CTIP is to address the specific trade and investment barriers that exist, and that exist also in South Africa, and to streamline and simplify administrative requirements. We'll also work on the raw materials value chain with these investments, supporting in particular the local processing of materials. And this is what our South African counterparts call local beneficiation. We want to create local value addition and have the local processing of these materials in South Africa. It's not an extractivist investment. Also, along those lines, let me just make one point very clear. EU investment always follows environmental, social, and governance standards. And these standards will be again reaffirmed for covered supply chains in the CTIP. As Cláudia also mentioned, the existing EPA, SADC EPA, already has trade and sustainable development provisions, But what must be highlighted here is that it's vital for the EU that proper ESG standards are followed when developing new projects. And this is a sine qua non conditions for the EU and its member states. So maybe now reacting to a little bit the points that were made in the discussion and also in the documentary. As I was saying, our investment, our approach is not an extractivist one. It's a sustainable one. We adhere strictly to ESG standards, and these standards include consultations with all stakeholders, including local communities. Our investment model is also 360 degrees because, again, it wants to foster local value addition, this beneficiation I was talking about, and it includes programs to support skill development, to support SME development, and job creation. And let me here also mention one important point. We have carried out different studies in terms of the energy transition, and those studies tell us that the transition to renewable energies in South Africa can create up to 800,000 jobs. And this compared to the 325,000 jobs which would be lost with phasing out fossil fuels. So the balance is immensely positive and is one which is appealing to a country where, of course, as our previous speaker was saying, faces problems of joblessness and incorporating a very young population into the labor market. This is a very important point that I wanted to make. And also, let me just say that in terms of the green hydrogen more particularly, as far as I know, and from the projects mentioned in the documentary that we have seen, the EU is not involved nor supporting any of the projects mentioned in the documentary. And I want to make also another point very clear on why on the investments that the EU may be doing on green hydrogen in South Africa. The purpose of those investments is not to export raw green hydrogen to the EU. That is not the objective. The green hydrogen that would be generated in South Africa would be mostly used by local industries to produce derivatives, finished or semi-finished products like ammonia, which could then be exported to the EU. So again, there is this element of local beneficiation, of local industrialization, if I may say so. So I think those points are important to make. This being said, again, as part of our investment chapter in the CTIP, we will be listening to the relevant stakeholders, consulting the communities, and very much having this democratic debate, as you call it, chairman, because that is part of our DNA. And moving to the second aspect, this regulatory cooperation. So the tools are investment and regulatory cooperation. As I was saying, we have a number of...
Could we speed a bit up, because we have lots of MEPs here keen to ask questions and to come in. So if you could come to the end, it would be good for our further discussion here.
Okay. No, perfect. Sorry, I don't want to take too long. I just wanted to say that the regulatory cooperation is a very important element, and it will create an additional platform to have a dialogue with South Africa on things like our autonomous instruments, including, of course, CBAM. Just then to conclude, Chair, on the next steps and timeline, I think you summed it up very well in your introduction to say that our objective is indeed to have a conclusion of the CITIP at the time of the G20 summit in November. We are now starting our detailed engagement with South Africa on a text, a text, and we'll be, of course, keeping the Parliament fully informed as we have been doing up to now on any developments. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Director, for this very holistic picture that you were giving us from the side of the Commission. May I repeat before I give the floor to my colleagues? First speaker will be Tilly Metz, our Vice Chair. Can I repeat one important sentence only to clarify? You have just said EU is not involved in any examples that have been showcased by the documentary. Is that what you said?
Yeah, that's what she said. That's what I heard.
Are you still with us? I hope so. Otherwise, we will come back to that.
I am, but it's your technicians who are controlling the sound.
Forgive me. So it's not your fault. No, only to verify what you said. You said whatever we have seen in examples that were criticized by local communities is not with the involvement of the European Union. That was what you said, right?
That is the information I have, yes.
Thank you very much. Tilly.
Thank you very much, and also on my behalf, thank you for the very interesting presentation, and also for the documentary that we had the occasion to see here. I found it very, very interesting, and also a lot of alarm clocks things we have to be aware. So thank you very much for that. I have 3 points I want to address. The first point is concerning the free, prior, informed consent. So we heard also powerful testimonies here in the documentary, but in general from communities in South Africa, especially coming from indigenous people like the Nama, who are being left out of decisions about major green hydrogen projects planned on their land. There is little to no consultation, let alone genuine consent. And yet the EU has repeatedly affirmed its commitment to free, prior and informed consent, most recently before the Human Rights Council in June 2025, but words are definitely not enough. So my question is, what has, and is a question to Madame Correia, what has the EU actually done to uphold this free, prior and informed consent in its dealings with the Nama people, for example? And also, what concrete steps will be taken to ensure that communities affected by green hydrogen projects are not sidelined, but actively included in decisions that reshape their land and their future? And then also regarding better use of renewable energy sources for more green hydrogen, realizing South Africa's plan of exporting significant quantities of green hydrogen would need a vast increase of installed renewable energy capacity. And Boge sorry, I mispronounced it probably, project alone would require South Africa to increase its current installed renewable capacity sixfold in order to meet the project's green hydrogen production targets. However, the South African grid is currently coal-based, and you confirmed it also by your figures, while the vast majority of this population do not have access to clean, affordable energy. So would the investment in renewable energy sources in South Africa not better be directed toward helping South Africa decarbonize its own grid and provide energy access to its population rather than creating green hydrogen? And why is it not the focus of the CTIP? If the global gateway is supposed to be the investment arm of the CTIP, so why is the global gateway not investing in clean, affordable, renewable energy rather than in green hydrogen, which would actually serve the needs of the South African in that case? And then on Sasol, I have different information, I must say. So the company that we saw in the movie, it's a petrochemical giant with a long history of coal-based fuel production. CTIP is supposed to help Sasol export sustainable aviation fuel to the EU by addressing compliance and regulatory issues. Now, we are told that this mention came at South Africa request, but we also know, thanks to the work of investigative journalists and civil society, that Sasol, along with German company Enertrag, has been actively lobbying both the Commission and the German government to weaken EU definitions around hydrogen and sustainable fuels. So in other words, there is a growing concern that Sasol may soon be able to export coal-based fuel under the EU Greens label, something that would utterly undermine our climate credibility. So what concrete safeguards are in place to ensure that the CTIP will not be a backdoor for Sasol coal-derived fuels, rebranded then as sustainable to enter the EU market? And also more broadly, how can we ensure that addressing regulatory barriers does not become a code for watering down environmental protection under the pressure of corporate interest? And then my very last question, I have to ask it and I finish on that, is to Mrs. Yegeshni Moodley. How would you like to see the EU supporting sustainable development in South Africa? Because if investing in green hydrogen for export isn't currently appropriate for the South African context due to all the reasons we have heard, what then should the global gateway funds be spent on, in your view? And I finish there. Thank you.
Well, that is fully fledged question there for two other meetings, but this is the reason for me to form a basket. Next speaker is Fabio and then Michael Gahler.
Thank you very much. I may apologize if I didn't remember all the names of our interlocutors. That has to do with the Strasbourg week, because my brain capacity always declines a little bit by the middle of the week. So that's not meant to be impolite. Just two main points. The first one, I think you raised a very legitimate point. We don't reach our climate targets if we simply would base our relationship on an extractive model where you would not effectively decarbonize your domestic production, but we would just basically outsource our own tasks to you, and then you're still relying on the coal model. So you said that one problem, I think, to develop your domestic solar energy would be the availability of land. Of course, this hydrogen plants take a lot of land for solar up, but if that would go primarily into export, my question is, how does the land question in South Africa play into this? So how is currently solar industry developed domestically? I guess probably a lot of economic rents go to landowners if you want to put up solar plants there, because there's not a lot of public land available. What is your take on that? What could be changed domestically to address that issue? That's my first question. My second one, you spoke, I think, the representative of COSATU about grants and the high interest rate environment in South Africa. Do you also address that domestically? Because I think you have currently a monetary policy approach which favors very open capital accounts, but at the same time very high interest rates. Is that something that you also bring up in the domestic policy debate in South Africa?
Thank you, Fabio. Michael Gahler.
Yes, thank you very much. Well, as the agenda says, we might have within this clean trade and investment partnership a special focus on green hydrogen. That is the one point. When we were there in February, I had the impression, we asked the questions how the energy mix will develop, and I had the impression, and we heard the figures, 84% is still coal-based. 84%, and the answer was that this focus will not drop dramatically in the short term. So my question is, when it's about actually having an effect on the ground, also when it comes to reducing the CO2 emissions, should it not be one aspect apart from green hydrogen to simply have, I'm not a technician, but to add filters to existing coal plants in order to reduce substantially the output? Wouldn't that be something that has an immediate effect if that were done, rather than keeping it as it is with the old technology and no filters or very bad ones, and then continuing and hoping that at some point it might have a different effect? So is adding or renovating technology in this regard, because of the high percentage of coal production that will be continuing, is that an aspect in our cooperation?
Any other colleague with questions? Rudi Kenneth.
Yes, thank you. Regarding the voices of absent of EU decision making. I think it's not just only the problem of the lack of participation, but also there within the EU decision making. While the voices of the people, the locals, are not being heard, it's quite clear, at least in the past. The Commission says now we're going on new roads or whatever that may means, but the hydrogen lobby has been very well involved and actually almost made a blueprint how to do things for the EU. How is this going to change? Are we going on the same road? This is a question to the Commission. And then secondly, to the lady of COSATU, because in the past I was privileged to work together very closely with the comrades of NUMSA in Port Elizabeth and in Johannesburg, so I know a little bit how multinationals go along with trade unions. If I hear now the Commission, they say more or less that they are willing to do things in another way as they did in the past. My question to you is, do you see this already, and are you more involved now than in the past, or do you think in this way, do you see improvements? Thank you.
Okay, any other colleague? Did I forget? Did I oversee some? No, good. Then my proposal, we have some 10 minutes, not much more. My proposal is we go 2 minutes each speaker to answer, and we give a bit more to the Commission at the final stage, because there was a lot of question to the Commission, so that the director has the opportunity to answer in a more comprehensive way. I would ask Ms. Moodley for 2 minutes, please. We have problems with the connection. Then I would call on our trade union voice, Tanya van Meelis, for 2 minutes.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the questions. On the issue of high interest rates, COSATU has consistently called for a lowering of interest rates in South Africa. Interest rates are set by the Reserve Bank, which is an independent body. Part of our calling for a reduction in interest rates is coupled with our call to extend the mandate of the Reserve Bank so it has a developmental agenda rather than just focusing on currency stability. On the issue of seeing improvements in terms of how the EU is engaging and from the person who's been working with NUMSA and the unions in South Africa, I hate to say, I hear from the discussions that there's an openness which is welcomed. I haven't seen it in practice on the ground. The first time that COSATU has been engaged on the CTIPs is actually in this meeting. So we welcome further engagement. If you are moving in that direction, we urge you to do so with haste. We'll always meet and contribute towards a shared outcome. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Cláudia, you have 2 minutes to come in as well.
Thank you very much, Chair. I will not take the 2 minutes. I just wanted to say one question to the Commission, if I may, because I think it would be important to clarify something that it's in the final statement of the declaration when the CTIP was announced, is that the Commission will also be negotiating an MOU on raw materials. Is that part of the CTIP itself? Is it something separate? It would be quite relevant to clarify whether it would be the same as the MOUs that we've been seen concluding in the previous mandate or something different. And then one final remark from my side, because obviously I focus my intervention on all the sustainability commitments that we should see in the context of the CTIPs. but it would be important at the same time to not lower our sustainability standards at home, right? There is a really interesting study by ECDPM that shows that third countries actually don't mind necessarily a more transactional approach to EU foreign policy. What they do reject is this perceived double standards and this top-down approach. So going to the negotiating table with our sustainability standards lowered at home will also impact our negotiating position. So I just call on the Commission and on the Parliament and all the EU institutions to not weaken our own sustainability regulations here. Thank you very much for having me. It was a really, really interesting discussion.
Thanks for your input. Do we have Ms. Moodley now? Okay, then I will go directly to Dora from the Commission, because there is you have many things on the plate, so please come in.
Much and indeed going straight to the questions. So the first question by Honourable MEP Tilly Metz on the consultation of the Nama people and the Baranbai projects. Again, these are not supported by the EU, so I could not reply to those questions. I think those questions need to be put to the South African government, given that these are national projects. What I can tell you in terms of your third question on supporting indeed the upgrading and strengthening of the South African electricity grid, that is indeed part of the discussions, and it is a much needed improvement in terms of South Africa infrastructure. And I'm happy to say that not only is it part of the CTIP discussions, it's also covered by the investment package that we were mentioning of 4.7 billion euros. And there is, I believe, an EIB project precisely to support the upgrading of that electricity grid. On Sasol, indeed, it is reflected in the summit statement. And the South African government has asked the EU further discussions on finding short and long-term solutions to enable Sasol to export sustainable aviation fuel to the EU. That is not the case at the moment, and what we are doing we are engaging in legal and technical discussions with the South Africans to basically help them set a roadmap to ultimately, we hope, attain that objective. Because for the moment, and that is very clear, the EU legislation in this field, notably RED 2 and RED 3, has to be, of course, respected by South Africa. And this enforcement of existing legislation, it's what actually ensures the high sustainability, the real sustainability of fuel imports to the EU. So the fact that we are ready to sit down and discuss with our South African counterparts how to support Sasol in decarbonizing, how to support Sasol in discussing, including the Segunda plant, is basically a sign that we are ready to engage in decarbonization discussions. But of course, it's not a sign that we are ready to give in on our legislation, which is, of course, the token that, or the I would say that the gateway to ensure the real sustainability of any fuel imported into the EU. I think there was also a question by Honourable MEP Gahler on the issue of filters to existing green hydrogen plants. I'm not
to hydrogen, to coal plants. They are polluting.
Excuse me. Yes, excuse me. I'm not an expert on necessary technology. What I can tell you is that the CTIP will include an element of discussing clean technology, identifying relevant clean technology and its supply chain. And ultimately, the objective is that the trade, so the import and export of that clean technology between the EU and South Africa is facilitated. So So if that is part of the answer, then the CTIP should indeed contribute to that happening. Honourable MEP Kenneth, you had a question about the participation of local communities. As I said, any EU project abides strictly to environmental, social and governance criteria. And the consultation of local communities is part of those criteria. So as regards projects carried out with EU support, that consultation should take place. Of course, if you are referring again to the projects that were included in the documentary, again, those do not have EU support as far as I know today. So that would not be indeed present for those projects as far as I know. And then to reply to the question raised by Cláudia on the MOU on critical raw materials. So as I said, the idea of the CTIP is that it is an umbrella covering existing instruments or new instruments. And the MOU on critical raw materials, which is now being negotiated with South Africa, is similar to MOUs with other countries, existing MOUs with other countries on critical raw materials. So those discussions are being pursued in parallel, the idea being that then this MOU will be part of this umbrella of instruments being brought under the CTIP. So I hope that the discussions go smoothly and in parallel for us to be able to include this MOU, which is a separate instrument, in the CTIP to be concluded by November. And lastly, on the sustainability criteria, I'm responsible for trade and sustainable development as well, so you can imagine that I am very forthcoming and very firm in terms of keeping up the standards, the sustainability standards that we are pursuing. As you know, the EU has the most ambitious sustainability policy as regards its trade policy. And I would also like just to leave here a note. We have carried out an ex-post evaluation of the environmental impact of our FTAs, and the conclusions are rather positive. So indeed, we are, we have an acquis of which we can be proud of, and it's definitely our intention to keep up that good work. Thank you very much.
Many thanks for this final statement. I have to close the meeting, but not without paying my regards and give my special thanks to Corporate Europe Observatory. Are we still connected? Okay, then I step back. If Yegeshni Moodley is connected, then she has 2 minutes. If we can afford... What do we have?
No, it's the same issue, yeah.
No, then we have to close the meeting. So, guys, first of all, many thanks to all our speakers. Many thanks to those who involved themselves today. I pay an enormous gratitude to Corporate Europe Observatory for having kicked off our meeting with this documentary. I know that not all questions could have been solved today, but we get further and further to intensifying our dialogue with local communities, with NGOs, with people in the front line directly involved. I thank in that sense also Yegeshni Moodley, especially for her comments, Tanya van Meelis, Cláudia Azevedo, and from the Commission side, Dora Correia. I would like to thank also my colleagues here in the delegation, because I have to say, according to the numbers of the secretariats, the South African delegation today is one of the best attended delegations all over the European Parliament. So that is due to your commitment, to your engagement of my bureau, the Vice President, Michael Gahler, who was leading the trip to South Africa in February. So many thanks to all staff involved, to the technicians that made it possible to have this broad communication, to our interpreters. We will invite you for our next meeting in September, and the agenda will be distributed as soon as we get confirmation so that you can prepare yourself, Have an excellent summer. And this is not a one-off, but rather the opening of a broad conversation of South Africa files with civil society, with our institutions, and of course with our parliamentary colleagues. Thank you very much.